Good evening, everybody. You're all very welcome to the Tuesday night programme with us, Social Rights Ireland and the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum. And we're joined for the second time this year by Dr. Tim Anderson. He's tuned in from Sydney. It's very early where you are, Tim, and it's getting late where we are near bedtime. But it's absolutely great to have you back because the last time you gave a very comprehensive and detailed analysis of the situation in Iran. And we talked an awful lot about how mainstream media had created a narrative that really vilified Iran, and how we were looking at how there was this organic people's revolution that has really been co-opted, very sadly, but not surprisingly, by the liberal left, or the so-called left, across Europe as well. But things have escalated pretty quickly in uh, the last week, actually. So it's good to have you back, Tim, to discuss the topic of Zionist aggression on Iran. So we do want to focus on what that looks like, and even the preposition I thought about it's Zionist aggression on Iran. It's not in Iran. The threat is imminent. And how serious do you think that threat actually is at this moment in time, Tim?
Yes, well, it's very serious, as if you've been watching, most of the well-informed commentators anticipate a US attack on Iran, a military attack on Iran within days, perhaps, with all of the hardware that's being assembled offshore at the moment in particular, and also with the inability of Trump to be able to find, as they say, an off-ramp, basically, because he's been pushed in the direction of an attack by Netanyahu to do something that he doesn't really want to do, because Trump is very averse to a conflict which is going to cause casualties and going to undermine his image, which is what drives him, basically. That's the strange state of affairs, really, that the Israelis are the major player that wants this attack on Iran now. They want the US to do it on their behalf, and hardly anyone else wants to do it. Trump is now being advised by his own generals that there's some serious risks here, partly because of the Iranian capacity, and partly because there is a level of integration of Russia and Chinese, at least logistic support, to a level which we haven't seen before. And so the risks of escalation, the risks of prolongation of an action which Trump, in his idealistic moments, imagined something like the action he took in Venezuela, where he kidnapped the head of government, apparently with minimal US casualties, and then escaped, basically. That's not going to happen here. It's going to be a much more serious conflict.
Thank you, Tim. And when we're talking about the type of conflict that we might expect to see, how do you envisage that play out? Do you think, like, for example, is it even possible for a ground invasion, or will it materialize through attacks from the ships that are surrounding Iran at this moment in time?
Trump certainly doesn't want, and probably doesn't have the capacity to carry out a ground invasion of Iran. It would require a much greater operation than that which the US undertook in Iraq, in what, 23 years ago. And the US simply doesn't have the capacity to do that. Certainly, it would involve very large US casualties, to which Trump is very averse, basically. So it seems much more likely we're going to see aerial and missile attack on key installations in Iran, with the aim of trying to destroy the state, trying to cripple it in some way that would make it very difficult to recover its capacity to exist as a state, and to support the allies in the region, which is the key reason why the Israelis and Trump and the entire color revolution is being mobilized, because the Islamic Republic of Iran, whatever you think of religious states, it's something that has very strong support inside Iran, contrary to the Western propaganda. it's something that it's an entity that has consistently supported the Palestinian resistance since 1979, and many of the independent peoples in the region, other independent peoples in the region, in Lebanon, formerly in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, for example. So Iran is the sponsor not of terrorism, but of giving the means for the independent peoples of the region to defend themselves from imperialism and from Zionism. And that's really the key reason why it's come under attack.
So the fact that Israel wants regime change in Iran, that this is not actually coming from the Trump administration. You've touched on why, the significance of Iran for Israel, but is it just because it is part of the axis of resistance? Is it only because Iran has supported the resistance, or what other reasons are there for this aggression from the Zionist entity? Is it part of the Greater Israel Project? How broad is the aggression, or the reason for the aggression? How deep does it go?
I mean, the US deep state would like regime change in Iran because the US deep state has a ideology basically of trying to control the world, to be the dictator of the world. Basically, they have military doctrines which talk about full spectrum dominance, ideologically, economically, as well as militarily and in communications. But the cooler heads amongst the US deep state know that Iran is beyond their capacity to do this. So while they would like to do it, while they certainly don't want to see, in principle, any independent pole of power or independent pole of a group of nations coming together, they're opposed to BRICS, they're opposed to Russia and China, representing independent poles of power in the world. But they're not launching attacks on Russia and direct attacks on Russia and China and Iran up to this point. It's the Israelis that are obsessed with Iran mainly because Iran is an independent state which provides support for the Palestinian resistance. And the main reason why the Palestinian people still exist, because without resistance, the Palestinian people would have been erased from West Asia, from that part of the world some time ago. It's because the Palestinian people have resisted, and they've had some strong regional supporters, in particular Iran, that they continue to survive as a people, basically. So the Israelis have a much stronger, and I am one that considers the Israelis as part of the US deep state, basically. Perhaps, the Zionist tail on an imperial dog, but nevertheless, the US is ultimately in control here. But in recent times, the Israeli faction of the deep state has assumed much greater influence, for example, more than it had in the 1970s, for example. So the Israelis are particularly obsessed, and they have a lot of resources at their disposal to try and influence the rest of the US deep state, basically. And Trump is simply a creature of this deep state, and as we know now, very, very substantially funded and perhaps also blackmailed in terms of the Epstein class of people by the Israeli faction of his own deep state. So the Israelis are the one that have this urgency, and it's very well known that Netanyahu, the current leader of the Israeli regime, has been campaigning for at least 30 years with the main scare story that Iran is on the verge of creating nuclear weapons and will then be a threat to the region and to the entire world. This has been disavowed not just by the Iranians in principle, but also by the US intelligence agencies. Nevertheless, it's been perpetuated still by US officials, but in particular by the Israelis. And the Israelis have added on to that because it's not sufficient for their leverage purposes or for what they demand at these moments from the US, the demand that Iran divests itself of the very deterrent that has prevented attacks so far, that is to say, its advanced missile capability, part of which we saw in action in the 12-day war in June last year. And the Israelis also demand extraordinarily that Iran stops supporting any of its, what they call proxies really are, its independent allies in the region, in particular the Palestinian resistance and the resistance in Lebanon and the revolutionary government in Yemen, which, contrary to the popular jargon, is Houthi rebels. Actually, it's a revolutionary government led by Ansar Allah in Sana'a, and which controls most of the populated areas of Yemen. The Israelis are very worried about the involvement of Iran's allies in if and when they and the US decide to attack Iran again. There's been some talk of them carrying out some sort of preemptive strikes in Lebanon and in Yemen. They have been bombing Yemen ever since, Lebanon ever since the so-called ceasefire that they carried out with the Lebanese state. But there's been some talk of perhaps some preemptive attacks by the Israelis on Lebanon and Yemen just before or at the same time as the US is going to strike Iran again.
Thank you very much, Tim. And I'm going to come to Dr. Saeeb Shahs on, because you've touched on two things, Tim, and maybe Saeeb, if you wouldn't mind expanding on the significance of the Epstein class or the Epstein network, or rather than just the Epstein files, like why at this particular moment in time much is being filtered from us, like a lot of information is being withheld. And also then Tim mentioned the support that Iran might have, or Iranian proxies, but maybe you could talk about who might be the proxy forces that might support the Zionist entity, or that might support an attack on Iran, apart from the US itself.
Concur with Tim 100% of what he said, and hello to everyone. The Epstein files, if I want to look from my own point of view, I think it's this is the nature of imperialism all along, how it works from the times of the East Company of East India, which was occupying in behalf of the British aristocrats the world and reading it, and this is how they used their own tricks to take over by blackmail lots of entities and to recruit lots of people in that way. And in that way, the British used local indigenous people to fight the British Empire's war and to conquer places for empire. And I believe at the same time, while we are focusing on the Epstein files and what's happening with that, and we know who is in it. We know the ruling elite of the United States of America, including its own president, are involved and deeply involved, and people knows that. And the problem is nobody is doing anything about it except arresting in England here and there. All of this was. I heard myself an interview of Stephen Bannon, one of the brains behind Trump, with their God Lord Epstein, and he's talking about during the crash of 2008, while he was in jail in the cells, how he was like James Bond, holding two pay phones on each ear and directing companies and taking advantage of the crash. Why was he in jail at that time, 2008 and 2007, and then think the whole thing is been for years. But at the same time, I believe there is they diverted our attention to these things while there is cooking something bigger going to happen. There is a lot of things were happening, and I had an interview maybe 3-4 weeks ago with UK Observer about the ID card before the government is stopping that, and you can see who is the guys behind this. You can see the fingerprints of Mandelson and Tony Blair and all of these guys in creating like the Big Brother's government within the United Kingdom. The same thing in the United States of America. So these guys are not just like a small tiny guys. They are part of a huge global kind of a plan to control the population of the world and to eliminate any independent state or country or entity like Iran. Iran itself, it's a free independent country. It's been fighting to guard sovereignty from the day of the Islamic Revolution in 1979 and till today. This is why you can see, as Tim emphasized, within the Iranian revolution system, as the ethos and the values, the Iranian people in their even constitution, they will stand by any oppressed people anywhere in the world. They were giving their hands to a lot of countries in Latin America and a lot of people within Asia or West Asia, and especially the Palestinian people. And I said that at your podcast, and I said it, I think, at some other platforms. You know, the year of 1979 was a very sensitive year for the region when the Iranian Revolution broke at the time, and the Iranian people cleansed the presence of the United States of America and the British out of their country. That time was happening. Of course, there is I call it the killing and the poisoning of the revolutionary leader of Egypt, Nasser, in 1970, and then inherited by an appointed CIA president at the time. This is the way I look at it myself, Sadat. And since then, everything happened in Egypt, shifting Egypt from pro-revolutionary. Egypt used to lead what they call it the non-aligned movement, and there was Africa in Asia and in Latin America. They looked, even Che Guevara and Castro used to say Nasser was the mentor for them when they see him was confronting the British imperialist power and the French imperialist power with their Zionist dog. The Egyptian people managed to defeat them with the help of the international free people of the international community. That time in 1979, all of that history was wiped out by Sadat. And that time, Egypt fell to the Zionist domination and America's domination in the Egypt. And Egypt used to become from a leading country to a country is destroyed economically and begging for international help. And in 1979, suddenly the Iranian Revolution came and kicked what they call the policeman of the United States of America in the region, Shah of Iran. And suddenly the balance of power start tilting toward the resistance again. And so Israel found a force in there which can support the resistance groups of the Palestinian ones in Lebanese and now today in Iraq and in Yemen. Regarding the resistance question, what you mentioned, the resistant factions, and I want to object to the term you use, the proxies. Iran doesn't have a proxies in the region. These are liberation movement in the region. In Yemen, or the Hashd al-Sha'bi mobilized forces, popular mobilized forces in Iraq, or the Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the other factions in Lebanon and the Palestinian resistance. All of them are independent, groups who they take their own decision to counter or not to counter. But all of them declared, in Iraq, in Yemen, and Lebanon, they will defend the Islamic Revolution, and they will target the aggressors, which is the Zionist entity or American interest in the region. This is declared, and at the same time, as rightly Tim mentioned, if you notice the attack on Hezbollah, since Hezbollah is declared their commitment to the ceasefire, and is still killing thousands in Lebanon, and tens of thousands of raids happen in Lebanon. The last one was significant in the Beqa Valley in Lebanon. They killed more than 10 people, and they said one of them or two were commanders in Hezbollah. Hezbollah doesn't want to be sucked in to respond directly to the Zionist entity in a war which is the Zionist entity will invade up to Beirut and try to dig deep to find any kind of missiles or resistant kind of capacities hidden in Lebanon. They want to find that before anything breaks out with the Iranian. But Hezbollah is playing it very smart and absorb all the attacks, and it doesn't respond, since adhering to what the Lebanese government wants, and at the same time showing the people who is defending Lebanon. Nobody is defending Lebanon if the Lebanese resistance led by Hezbollah doesn't act to defend the people. I don't want to take it any further, but the last point I want to say in here, which is I hope I can add to on Comrade Tim, the whole thing of what we see, if you hear the conversation between Tucker and the American ambassador what's his name, Huckabee, in the Zionist entity. This can show at least, or shed the light on one thing. What is the Zionist project of the Greater Israel, which is, to me, I always say the real name of it is American hegemony in West Asia and the Arab world. The biblical name for it, Greater Israel. In simple terms, this is the American policy in the region. From the 50s, from maybe 1954, the United States of America, when it started to create the back of Baghdad, the alliance, which is reactionary forces against liberation movement in the region. The United States of America clearly had two major pillars in its foreign policy. The first one, to inherit everything the British and the French empires have positioned anywhere in the world. Take it from Vietnam to the Middle East to North Korea, South Korea, all of that areas. And in the Middle East, you see they took the United States tried to inherit the United States. The British took ownership of the Zionist entity and start fighting in the region to put its own dominance. And the second pillar, to deny Pan-Arabism, which was revolutionary movement to liberate the Arab world from these empires and from these colonial forces. The one major thing is for the United States of America, if the Arabs are united, that means this is the heart of the world. 22 countries become united again as one entity with the resources, with their geopolitical position, with the amount of resources and the size of the population in there, can bring back the historical legacy of this area and become a force which is the United States of America cannot counter, or West Europe cannot counter. And that is why the United States of America always do something which is the Zionist entity turned against the Palestinian, mowing the lawn. And this mowing the lawn, always you can see in the region within 5 to 6 years, always there is a military attack to destroy one country or region. As General Wesley Clark, the former NATO commander, said around 2001, when he was after the Twin Towers attack, which is it's another story. He said he's seen a list at the Pentagon. Some of his comrades said the United States of America have to destroy 7 countries now, 7 wars: Iraq, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. All of them countries, apart from Iran, being attacked and destroyed. And this is as you can. Jeffrey Sachs always say it's on the advice of Netanyahu. And the last one is left is Iran. Iran, the only, again, sovereign, independent state who supports in its constitution and in its value system the resistant and the oppressed people. The United States of America doesn't want to see that. It wanted to focus on its own sphere of influences while destroying Iran and making sure its proxy, the Zionist entity, can deal with this region after the United States of America will leave part of its huge military armada in that which is gathering in the region at the doorstep of the Zionist entity to use to keep control of this area, while the United States of America deal with the Western Hemisphere sphere of influence and trying to contain China in the future. Controlling Iran, it means, first of all, the light oil of Iran which they needed it, the United States of America, to take to Venezuela to be able to reuse this heavy oil of Venezuela around the world is vital. To deny access of the Chinese to Iranian resources is vital. To deny the Russian access to Iran and this geopolitical position is vital to corner the Chinese and to corner the Russian. And that's why you can see the Chinese and the Russians were taking part of military games with the Iranian, just meters away from the American military assets. What that says to them, it's Iran won't be left alone. As Tim said, at least logistics support, at least some military advance, which we know a lot of military advanced weapons being delivered by the Chinese and the Russian to Iranian. So Iran's battle for America, it's the demise of the great American power.
Thank you very much, Saeed, for joining in there and responding to both the questions I asked and commenting on Tim. Back to you, Tim. Saeed has just mentioned at the end there about Iran's strategy to close off the Strait of Hormuz. So if we saw the consequences for a couple of hours, I think it was last Thursday that happened. Our good friend, Professor Morandi, keeps insisting, I think if anybody's following, you know what he says, that Iran does not want to start any war. They do not want to start anything, but they are preparing for war, and they've been preparing for the last 25 years. So if the Strait of Hormuz were to close, Tim, what are the consequences? What would be the outworkings of that for the world? The global effects.
Yes, thank you, Roshin, and thank you, Said, for that commentary, particularly the historical perspective, which is very useful. Of course, the problem of Pan-Arabism has been a sad story in many respects, because most of the Arab regimes are now comprador regimes, basically, but nevertheless reconfiguring themselves in the new circumstances. You know, for example, the Saudi role is interesting now that they have a close relationship with the Russians and the Chinese. In other words, and even the Emirates, who have been collaborating with the Israelis very closely, are now seen with a jealous eye by the Saudis. So there is a fair bit of squabbling amongst the thieves in the Persian Gulf now, which can lead to some new configurations, basically. But in terms of Hormuz, the strait between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, it's something like 20% of the world's oil comes through there. So if that strait is closed or monitored in a way that the Ansar Allah-led revolutionary coalition in Yemen monitored the Red Sea and blocked the supply to the Israeli regime, because it's probable that an Iranian closure would mean that they would simply screen which regimes were sending oil or receiving supplies, basically. It might not be a complete mind-off closure, but nevertheless, it could affect 20% of the world's oil, and that would have a huge impact on the price of oil. Already with that partial closure during the naval drills between Iran and Russia and China to a degree, there has been a rise in the price of oil just in the last week or so. So we'd see a very big impact there, not just from the closure of Hormuz, but also the destruction of facilities in some of those Gulf states like Qatar and Bahrain in particular, which are the two big hosts of US military. Bahrain has big US naval base there, and Qatar has the largest military base and US air base in the whole region. It's the headquarters of the so-called CENTCOM, by which the Pentagon has the entire world divided up into regions which they control. So the CENTCOM commander in Qatar is effectively the joint commander-in-chief of the Israeli so-called defense forces in occupied Palestine. So those targets, as well as the Israeli colony itself, are going to be designated by the Iranians as targets for retaliation if there is any sort of attack on Iran by the US, even a symbolic one. Apparently, the Trump administration did float the idea of some sort of symbolic attack because Trump likes this idea of some sort of symbolic strike, and then he can say, I've won, and goes away and got everything that he wants, basically. So the Iranians said, no, we won't do that. They have exhibited this almost infuriating strategic patience with all of the attacks carried out by the Israelis in recent years, and retaliated in very limited ways to gain intelligence about the air defenses of the Israelis and all of the other states involved on their behalf. Remember, in the 12-day war in June, it wasn't just the Israeli air defenses, it was the air defenses of France, of Britain, of the US, and the Comprador Arab states in the Persian Gulf. So all of that was mobilized to try and defend the Israeli regime back in June last year, at a time when the Iranians, it must be said, were caught with very limited air defense, and they were hit quite hard in the first days of that 12-day war. But nevertheless, they recovered to the point where the Israelis were being damaged far more in the final days of that 12-day war. We know now that with the help of, certainly with the help of China and probably with Russia to a degree, the air defenses in Iran are better. They are less likely to be taken by surprise, although they have not, it seems they're not going to carry out a preemptive strike on the US bases or the Israelis. It's in line with the tradition of their diplomacy is to present themselves as entirely reasonable and present themselves primarily to their own people, but also to the world, that they are pursuing every possible avenue to avoid a large-scale conflict, because everyone's going to lose in that region from a very large-scale conflict. So it's not a light thing to abandon any sort of talks, even if there is really nothing to negotiate with at this stage, as some in Iran are saying. And the others are saying, well, there's always something to talk about, talk about talks, and then you certainly convince your own people that you've tried everything possible to avoid a catastrophe falling on their heads. Because the sad thing is, while a lot of people are looking forward to a second round of Iranian retaliation on the Israeli regime, which could destroy great parts of it, and Netanyahu had apparently admitted this to Trump, it's also going to involve the death of many Iranian people, ordinary Iranian people. The Israelis killed over 1,000 in June last year. Only something like 24 Israelis were killed in the retaliatory strikes, which nevertheless hit the infrastructure and industrial and refinery capacity of the Israelis. It's going to be a much bigger strike and counter-strike this time. The impact on the economy is going to be very substantial. The impact also, I think this is what worries the US, on the reputation of the US and the image of the US, which is important for their bluff and their bluster and their projection of power all around the world. Trump is doing a lot of achieving a lot of what he would like to achieve simply by bluff and threats. And if that bluff is called out by another major power, a regional power, in this case Iran, and supported to a degree which we still don't know to what degree, but certainly through intelligence, through logistics, but through Russia and China, we don't know to what extent. It seems unlikely to me the Russians or the Chinese would directly involve themselves in defending Iran, but certainly they're providing much more in strategic terms, in logistic terms, in intelligence terms than they had before to help Iran defend itself, just as Iran has provided its resources to the Palestinians to help the Palestinians defend themselves. So we see a similar sort of process going on with Russia and China now, providing intelligence, air defense, anti-ship missiles. China's equivalent of GPS, which is independent of GPS. So in other words, satellite positioning and intelligence on the targets of the US in the region. That is to say, the air bases, the missile bases, and the ships, which have their own problems now because apparently the toilets are not working on the Gerald Ford. The biggest, most expensive aircraft carrier in the world is in danger of sinking under its own shit at the moment, apparently, and it's stopped off somewhere in the Mediterranean. So, what a terrible poetic justice it would be if the largest warship in the world, it was a sitting duck after that. So if you can destroy the command and control structure of a large ship like that, it becomes useless, basically. It can't steer properly. So apart from the prospect of sinking a large aircraft carrier, which is a big specter that's hanging over the US military at the moment, and some are saying that if the Iranians did sink an aircraft carrier, and it seems to be agreement that they could, not with one or two missiles, but with a a constant barrage, the response of the US would be extreme anger and vitriol to the point where some commentators are speculating they might use nuclear weapons against Iran. Now,
yeah, I was just going to come to that, Tim. What's your assessment of nuclear confrontation? Is it?
I am not an expert in that. But on the other hand, I'm somewhat skeptical of the suggestion that if a US aircraft carrier was used to launch attacks on Iran and the Iranians retaliated in some roughly proportional way and managed to damage, put out of action, or sink that aircraft carrier. Let's remember the Ansarallah revolutionary government, Ansarallah-led revolutionary government in Yemen drove away 2 aircraft carrier groups from the Red Sea, and the US accepted that basically. It would be more dramatic if one of them were sunk, but being put out of action is effectively the same sort of thing, because if the aircraft carrier can't maneuver, it can't receive and send warplanes. Also, it will be damaged as far as a platform for projecting aircraft power. Now, in the sense of intercepting aircraft, we see the spectre now that the Chinese have this satellite intelligence system which can detect stealth aircraft too. So even the US aircraft like the B-2s that were used out of Diego Garcia, a fairly long-range operation, which perhaps I'm not sure exactly whether the Iranian missiles can reach Diego Garcia. I'm sure the Iranian missiles can reach Cyprus. And Cyprus, the British airbase in Cyprus is being used by the Israelis to park or to offshore their warplanes. I am told, but I'm not entirely sure, that British airbase does not form part of NATO. So in other words, the Israelis could not, or anyone on their behalf could not invoke this Article 5 of the NATO agreement to say that an attack on Israeli warplanes in Cyprus was therefore an attack on NATO nations. I don't think that applies. I think that's one of the weak points of the Israelis, but a sensitive point for the Iranians, whether they would try and target the Israeli warplanes, because of course the Israelis have a large amount of US firepower in planes and missiles, and they remove them from the Israeli colony itself during a conflict. So, of course, one of the principal aims of the Iranian retaliation would be to try and destroy that military capital that the Israelis have, because they're not going to destroy the entire US military, but they certainly would retaliate against platforms which are being used against them, as they've done just really in more symbolic times in the past after the assassination of General Soleimani, when they hit the Al Ain Air Force Base in Iraq, for example, and later on in the 12-Day War when they hit the base in Qatar, the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. But after giving warnings to the US so that there were no real casualties or deaths, at least, amongst the US military, the Iranians were very cautious in that respect. And of course, they almost absurdly gentlemanly when it comes to the conduct of war in the region. They give the airlines, the Persian Gulf Airlines, warnings when they're about to carry out a missile strike, for example, so that Qatar Airlines and Emirates and so on can, even if they're hosting the US military, they were given warnings to cancel or delay their flights. I flew through the Persian Gulf during the 12-Day War, and some of the flights were cancelled, but flights were still carrying on in accordance with the Iranian firing schedule, basically. The Iranians have been and are keen to project to their own population and to the region that they are reasonable. They are trying to pursue every mechanism of avoiding an all-out war, which is going to involve the region. But they've also said that the region is going to be involved, and those that are collaborating with the US military to attack Iran now, as we speak, are not going to be spared this time. So it's something that worries all of the governments of the region. I think some of the commentators you've mentioned, or Saib, and you have mentioned Roisin, like Jeffrey Sachs, who after all is a US liberal who supports a two-state solution, so he's no radical by any means, but he's been a very important voice in terms of exposing the Zionist plot in the current circumstances.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm going to invite Tommy in to comment. Perhaps, Tommy, like what's come up between both Tim and Saib is that there's this reluctance on Trump's he doesn't seem keen to activate war, and Iran doesn't want to start a war. So, why is the Zionist aggression so forceful? How does it have so much control or dominance over the Trump administration? What does that say to us when we're trying to even understand Zionism and when we're trying to understand imperialism?
Well, for a start, I would suggest that if Trump is determined not to have a war, why would he have so much more material surrounding Iran? I'm afraid that somewhere within his spectrum and his advisors, the people that he's fronting up for, somewhere they're preparing, hoping or trying to at least be in a position to conduct some sort of an attack on Iran. Calculations would indicate that it would be unwise to launch a ground assault on Iran, and knowing that then if it's bombing operations that they will receive, there will be retaliation from Iran, understandably so. But what strikes me possibly is that there's echoes here of what happened at the First World War. That we're talking about an empire in decline. The United States is an empire in decline. There's no doubt about it now. It has a massive military presence, very powerful military, but its economy is in decline, particularly in relation to China. And there was something similar scenario before the First World War. And as Saib says, that Iran and the Middle East is, if you like, holds the global balance of power geographically. In the same way that in the past, what was the Balkans seen as holding a balance of power for the European power empires, the Middle East has now the geographical balance of power. My fear is that something could happen that could pitch the war without necessarily being planned in the long term. That some incident or a number of incidents could occur, precipitate in a war, or possibly brought about by the Zionist calculations that they need to strike, that they have a desire to strike, and that they'll be propelled into it. So that's a thing I'd like to find out from our two experts, Saib and Tim. Is there a danger that some unpredictable event in the past, go back and analogies can be invidious many times, but there is the fact that the British Empire, allied with the French, were reluctant to go to war immediately with the Germans and their allies, but at the same time that unpredictable event happened in Sarajevo with the shooting of Franz Ferdinand. I feel like a domino effect leading to the First World War. Is it possible something similar might happen in the Middle East, an attack on Iran provoked by Zionist malevolence and calculations?
Tim, would you like to respond to? Thanks, Tommy. Do you think there's the potential for just an incident that will provoke war?
Thank you, Russian. Thank you, Tommy. Yes, there's always, of course, virtually every major conflict has begun with some incident. But the problem is that Trump has really moved away from to some extent in line with the position that he's taken in the past in relation to the West Asian conflicts. He hasn't relied so much on the honeyed bullshit that the liberal class in the US tends to paint over its conflicts. This is why the media in the US always preferred the smooth-tongued Clintons and Obamas to the Bushes and the Trumps of the world, basically, because they like to sugarcoat their evil intentions, basically. Trump, in a sense, has been far more crude and vulgar and direct, although at times he resorts to some of these pretexts, like the nuclear pretext, for example, which is just a never-ending WMD scam. More than 2 decades after the WMD scam that they perpetrated in relation to Iraq, and of course, a problem is, as a Syrian diplomat said to me years ago, our mistake was we never punished the US for the invasion of Iraq, of course, after those sorts of crimes, and then, of course, they went crying about the Russian invasion of Southeast Ukraine to protect Russia and defend the Russian people in Southeast Ukraine, without a thought that the invasion of Iraq was a far worse operation. There was no self-defense pretext in the invasion of Iraq, and it set a precedent for the US doing what it wanted in the region. Of course, the objective of a so-called New Middle East was announced in Jerusalem by Condoleezza Rice in 2006 before the ill-fated invasion of Lebanon, one of the many invasions of Lebanon. But the one in 2006, where the Israelis were effectively defeated by Hezbollah at that time. So the idea of a new Middle East, with the chief lieutenants being the Israelis and then the Saudis and some of the other comprador Arab regimes, is front and center 20 years down the track from when it was announced in Jerusalem. It's less necessary in the current circumstances where you have not just a Republican president of the US, but what some called an open realist administration. Realist in the sense that they were talking directly about the interests. Trump says, we want the oil, we want this, we want that from different states, and then he moves ahead and does it. And perhaps later on, some of the other minions pick up the rationale, that some of Trump's officials are still talking about, like, what's his name, the J.D. Vance, the vice president, are still repeating the nuclear rationale. We can't let Iran, this sponsor of terrorism, have a nuclear weapon and so on. But the Israelis had moved on already. The Israelis are much less concerned about the nuclear file in a practical sense than they are from Iran's missile stockpile. That's why Netanyahu has been so keen to push Trump to expand whatever there is in his, while he tries for his own image to pretend that he's trying to cut a deal with the Iranians to push missiles and the support for allies in the region onto the agenda, basically. Everyone knows it's really a non-starter, basically, but nevertheless, the Netanyahu has been pushing that. There was a report, by the way, which I should mention, of the meeting between Netanyahu and Trump. Remember, Netanyahu made a special trip to see Trump just in recent times. And apparently the outcome of that was, well, he was trying to prevent Trump from entering into some sort of talks with the Iranians and give the impression that there was a possibility of some sort of deal, which Netanyahu feared that there might have been some sort of deal as the one that Obama eventually did with Iran in 2015. Nevertheless, at the end of that, what the reports that came out were that Trump insisted on going through the motions of trying to demonstrate that he was trying to work out some sort of deal, which in his mind meant basically Iran surrendering to everything that he had demanded. But he apparently said to Netanyahu, well, if we attack Iran, you have to be prepared for the consequences, because he was conscious of what happened in June last year. And Netanyahu apparently said to him, okay, we accept that they may be able to destroy large parts of the Israeli colony. That's okay, and inflict perhaps thousands of casualties. But that's okay, we will rebuild. So long as you commit yourself to a serious attack on Iran and to destroy the state, dismantle the state in some substantial way, we will bear with the consequences. Netanyahu speaking on behalf of his Jewish colonial constituency, which is going to suffer very serious consequences. But Netanyahu said, go ahead, we will accept those consequences if you can deliver our main objective in the region, which is to destroy our key regional enemy, to seriously damage the state in Iran. Of course, the prospects of actually changing the government in Iran are another story, but to diminish their capability by damaging their infrastructure, their military capacity, their industrial capacity, to the point where they don't pose a threat to the Zionist entity anymore. Netanyahu apparently has greenlit Iran for in terms of the obvious retaliation that Iran is going to inflict on the Zionists themselves. So that's just a little bit of background to the sort of pressure that and the consent, I suppose, that that Iran, because really effectively most informed commentators see Trump as effectively, although there are some contradictions between the US deep state and the Israelis, for example, even when it comes to Gaza, for example, the redevelopment of Gaza as some sort of Miami casino thing for Jared Kushner and some of the other US oligarchs, while the Israelis simply want to go ahead and push ahead with the the standard colonization that they're still doing, of course, in the West Bank at the moment. Let's not forget they've moved ahead substantially in terms of colonizing parts of the West Bank that they haven't yet reached there. So they're not exactly on the same page, but nevertheless, Trump is by and large green lighting most of what Netanyahu wants to do. But the limitations of the Israeli regime itself are shown by the fact that they can't do everything they want at once. They've attacked half a dozen countries in the region. They can't go and they haven't got the capacity to carry out another ground invasion of Lebanon at the moment. They would like to do it. They would probably like to do it through Syria, through the Bekaa Valley, with the support of some of the international so-called jihadists that are in surplus there for the ISIS regime in Damascus now, that they would get support, probably even direct support from some of the Uyghurs and the Chechens and the Albanians and the others that are sitting there in the Jilani regime there. But they haven't got the capacity to do that because, let's remember, the Israeli military has been propped up ever since October 2023 by its patrons, by mostly Western patrons, but also to some extent Russia and some other states. I think 12,000 US citizens have been in the Israeli military, 600 from my country, about 50,000 in all from foreign countries, propping up that Israeli military, propping it up with money, with weapons. The Israeli military would not exist if it were not for all this foreign support and co-option of mercenaries into the Israeli military there. So its capacity to carry out its other objectives, to attack Yemen, to attack Lebanon, to attack the popular mobilization forces in Iraq, it would like to do that to weaken them so that when the time comes when there is again direct firing between the Israeli regime and the Iranians, that Iran's allies in the region, and Saib is right, it's wrong to call them proxies, they have their own interests, they have their own capacities, and nevertheless they will come to the aid of Iran, and they will be supported by their religious authorities, the Zaydi religious authorities, Ansar Allah linked in Yemen, by the Marja in Iraq, Sheikh Sistani. There's going to be very strong moral and practical support for Iran in the region. They didn't come in June last year at the request of the Iranians. There was not a substantial mobilization of regional allies in support of Iran in June because Iran wanted it that way, but things will be different this time when there's a much larger scale conflict. And so the Israelis can expect to get hit from a number of different directions.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to go across to Morgan O'Kirga. He is our correspondent. He's based in Cork. He might have some questions to put to you, Tim, maybe to Saib, to Tommy, or comments. Morgan, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Roisin. And thank you for your presentation as well, Tim, and as well Saib and Tommy. Yeah, I suppose I've more thoughts than questions, but I think I could pose a question or two to Tim at the end. To Tommy's point as well about Diego Garcia, part of what makes Iran more capable this time around, in particular offensively, is that in 2025 they did develop new missile capabilities that can travel twice the distance of Iran to Diego Garcia. So Diego Garcia will be within range of their ICBMs. A key thing to note in terms of Iran's increased readiness for the upcoming war is that, you know, in terms of intelligence, obviously, we've seen it that they're far more capable than we realized in how they dealt with the attacks in January. Now, there was something stated in our last podcast as well on this topic. We speculated that Turkish intelligence might have helped them in terms of agents coming over their border, in terms of locating them in a timely fashion in order so that they could be rounded up before they could cause too much trouble. I'm not sure how correct we were in that assessment because there was another 100 MEK agents rounded up in the last 24 hours as well. But at the same time, Turkey is also allowing the US to use its airspace in order to spy on the IRGC near the border regions. So I'm not sure how much Turkey is really, or this idea that Turkey's, you know, moving more towards supporting Iranian defense. I don't know how accurate that is. Indeed, Turkey as well, because they have so many interests outside their borders now, because of their expansionist, approach in North Africa and in Syria as well in particular. It leaves them very open to, making deals. So I think what we might see in Syria, which is tipping the balance in Turkey's favor in the north, particularly north of the Euphrates, I think that might actually indicate that they would be more in favor of the West and Israel when it comes to a conflict with Iran. Another thing to note as well is I put the rounding up of the 100 MEK agents now down to increased capabilities of the security services in Iran. Another thing that they were able to do recently, some story emerged earlier today that a Dutch diplomat coming into the country was caught bringing in Starlink receivers. And indeed, earlier today, the leader of the National Endowment for Democracy said in Congress that the US had smuggled 200 Starlink receivers into Iran for the recent protest riots, whatever you would call them. I believe she was immediately cut off as well as soon as she said that. So it was a bit of a faux pas, I think, on her part. As well as the intelligence capabilities, they have received increased support from China and Russia. Now, the extent to which they have is open to debate. So they are purchasing anti-ship missiles from China, and they have been in the process of organizing for that transfer of anti-ship missiles for 2 years. But recent events has seemingly moved that process along. Between the Chinese anti-ship missiles that are coming in and the Chinese assistance in terms of live intelligence of American movements in the region, that shows that China might be kind of, not directly assisting Iran, but certainly favor Iran being able to stand on their own 2 feet and recognizing Iran's importance in the region to their own interests as well. Another way that they have increased their capability since June of 2025 is the decentralizing of their missile stockpiles. So one thing they notice is that in responding to the attacks that happened in June of 2025, they had to move their missiles before firing them into small clusters spread far apart, because they realized as soon as they fire missiles from a missile salvo from a stockpile in a particular area, there was a barrage coming immediately their way, which limited their capabilities. So Iran's defense right now, in terms of their air defense, is limited. As I said before, I'm an air defense, I'm a sort of defensive missile skeptic because of the power of modern day offensive missile capabilities. So I think that their trump card is in their offensive missile capabilities. So by decentralizing them, they have ensured that they can use all of their stockpiles in a potential war, which by all accounts is coming. On the Americans, I suppose, on Tommy's point for triggering wars, I think the likelihood of incidents that we have seen to justify wars in the last 35 years, I think is very limited, because I don't think they can get away with like a Gulf of Tonkin going back to the 60s, or the justification for the first Gulf War coming from Kuwait, or the WMD stories from Iraq, or what have you. I don't think that the public can be fooled anymore. I think there's just too much skepticism, and the administration in the US in particular is just reviled now because of their events over the last 12 months. The increasingly vicious nature of the West is a result of not having achieved their goals in West Asia in the window of opportunity provided by the 30-year era of unipolarity from 1991. I think as well, they don't necessarily need an incident to start the war, because consent is no longer necessary. Trump is obviously a spent brand, so they're going to try and get his way with as much as possible in the most revolting way, because imperialism requires it. They did the same with the Biden administration, particularly in the last 12 months there. They realized that the ruling classes realized that the Democrats were a spent brand. They realigned their interests with that of the Trump administration, rode in behind him, and got his way with as much stuff, much abhorrent, incidents in the last year of the Biden administration. And they're doing the same with Trump. And the process of Trump's administration, the brand of Trump being eroded, was much faster because of just how revolting the actions of the US empire is at the moment. In the US as well, there's a lot of, they're not getting what they wanted from the negotiations. And so that's why all this talk of war being inevitable is emerging. But indeed, some senior officers in America, they see the limitations of the conventional warfare as well. They don't think the serious military people in the US, they don't think they can actually defeat Iran. So the stakes are incredibly high. A defeat for the US in an outright war would indicate the writing on the wall as well for the Gulf monarchies. So despite this idea that some of the Gulf monarchies and Turkey as well, as mentioned, are kind of realigning or hedging their bets, I think that they certainly, if a war happens, they will defend the interests of the United States. So I think it's all just rhetoric when it comes to Iran, because a defeat of America against Iran would indicate the end of the Gulf monarchies' power being inevitable. The illusion of invincibility would be shattered for the monarchies. So Trump has been maneuvered into this position by the real powers in the Zionist West and Israel, and I don't think there's an easy way out anymore. As mentioned already, Iran has rejected the idea of a tit-for-tat sort of symbolic attack. The only thing that can happen now is all-out war, started by the West and Israel, which would be very damaging, but not fatal for Iran. The stakes are high, but it's impossible to tell exactly what's going to come from it. But I do not see under any circumstances the fall of Iran. As well, I think it was mentioned by Saeed that the Hezbollah's tactics of over the last 6 months in particular, just not responding to anything. I actually disagreed with that for a long time, because clearly Israel had great intelligence in Lebanon. So they were decapitating various leaderships of Hezbollah. But over the last 6 months in particular, Hezbollah has maintained their capabilities, has maintained their command structure, and has maintained support. And only in the last 24 hours, the Lebanese government has finally cracked under massive pressure domestically to instruct the Lebanese army to respond to Israeli attacks. Finally, that tactic is bearing fruit. So I'm very glad to see that. And I hope for the very best in the next couple of weeks. But I believe that Hezbollah has the capabilities of joining in a war should it emerge or should it happen immediately. So thanks, guys.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to you, Tim. I know we're conscious of time. I might go to you, Tim, to respond to that. And then Barry, looking at it through where our position is in Ireland, particularly for anyone who's like, oh my God, feeling overwhelmed. We're tiny. What can we do? Maybe I'll come to you after Tim, if that's all right, Barry, and we'll then soon wrap up. Tim, what do you think of Morgan's assessment, particularly on the last point there? Do you think Hezbollah is in a strong position and a strong enough position to support Iran?
Yeah, look, Morgan made a number of important points. On Hezbollah, I think that they have been forced in a way. It's true that the Israeli intelligence on the resistance in Lebanon was good. They cracked Hezbollah's communications. And one of the things that Hezbollah has been doing in the last year is completely rebuilding its communication structure. That's one of the things that it's invisible. We haven't seen it because for obvious reasons, that they were penetrated. The Israelis were able to destroy substantial parts of their stockpile, and all the effort that's been going on in the last year or so has been focused on rebuilding a secure communication system and logistic development, basically. They are, to my understanding, they are getting weapons, including through Syria, even though there's a hostile regime in Syria, but nevertheless, there's plenty of mercenaries in Syria too. So they will sell anything, some of the people that worked as mercenaries for the US, basically. So, and that includes selling weapons to their hated enemies. A couple of other things about what Morgan was saying. One thing is that communications is very important, as the Hezbollah case points out. And Morgan pointed out that it was, but the background to it was that I think it was Russia that actually gave them the capacity or showed them the capacity to shut down Starlink, basically. When they shut down the internet in Iran, the Starlink terminals were still showing access to internet, and they were able to identify the organizers of those terrorist attacks particularly on the 8th and 9th of January in Iran that followed on from the initial protests, basically. So they were able to identify who had the Starlink terminals and detain them, arrest them. And the communications were extremely important for those attacks that were being carried out in Iran, the deadly attacks being carried out in the middle of January that time. Almost certainly the US and the Israelis will be trying to reactivate what remains of their network in Iran, and they'll need a communication system And so probably they're trying to do that again, as I think Morgan mentioned, the case of the Dutch diplomat who was detained, he wasn't detained, they looked at some of his luggage and found that it had some elements of a terminal there. So there are, of course, this has been going on for some time in other parts of the world. In Cuba, I know some of the European governments were acting on behalf of the US to distribute money and facilities and so on, and NGOs, so they'll keep doing that because they need to have those communication links with their assets. If they have any, to the extent that they have any assets on the ground still in Iran, they'll want to deploy them when there's a much stronger outside attack there. From the Iranian point of view, it's important too that they maintain their own communication systems. And I think that the Chinese have been helpful in this because apparently the Chinese satellite radar network is something that is going to reinforce their air defense, which they need because they can't afford to be simply vulnerable. This was always the weakness of Hezbollah in Lebanon. There was hardly any air defense in Lebanon historically, basically, because the US was effectively preventing the Lebanese army from having it. On one occasion, Assad in Syria provided some Russian facilities to Hezbollah. The Israelis destroyed it, basically. All through the time when the Assad government was still there in Syria, the Israelis were knocking out radar across South Syria, in Sweda and other parts of South Syria, basically. So Lebanon was defenseless against air attack, against Israeli superiority. And that was always the Achilles heel there. I think one of the medium-term objectives has to be, for the regional defense, has to be rebuilding some sort of air defense. At least the Assad government had some sort of air defense. They took down one Israeli warplane and they prevented the Israelis from overflying Syria during most of that period. Of course, that was all destroyed with the Gilani regime. The Ansarullah-led government in Yemen does have some air defense. It has some capacity. They've taken down, I think, 20 of those Reaper drones and some of the warplanes too. So even the most basic of air defenses is useful and a serious deterrent to these so-called fifth generation warplanes. And apparently the Iranians have improved their capacity with Chinese help and with the Russian help there. Now, in terms of the war, this is another important thing that Morgan alluded to. Basically, in terms of who wins and who loses in a war, it's not that the Iranians are going to defeat the US militarily, but if they survive a US attack, a large-scale US attack, if they survive and inflict serious damage on the US and force the US to retreat, that will be a victory. It will be a tremendous defeat for the US military. This is really a larger version of what Hezbollah did to the Israelis in 2006, after all. Many more Lebanese were killed in 2006 than Israelis, but because the Israelis achieved none of their military objectives, they were forced to withdraw. They were beaten severe casualties were imposed on the invading Israelis, even though the casualties on the Lebanese side were greater. It was understood widely in the region, that Hezbollah had inflicted a defeat on the Israelis at that time. And I think that's what we are looking at, the likelihood of, not that the Iranians are going to defeat the US military, not that they're going to emerge unscathed, but if they survive and inflict some severe damage on the US military, it will be a tremendous blow to the image and the prestige and the reputation of US imperialism in the region. And all of its allies, as well as its opponents, are going to take notice of that and say, well, here's the big paper tiger. Everyone thought the Israeli military was invincible until 2006, when it was severely damaged by Hezbollah, which is, after all, not even a state actor. It was a militia, a resistance group within an independent country, which had a lot of compromises in terms of its state. After all, there barely is a state in Lebanon. That's why the resistance had to form separately, because the Lebanese army was effectively not allowed to even defend itself against Israeli attacks there, basically. And whatever the command in Lebanon is saying now, and there are good relationships between the Lebanese army and Hezbollah, but nevertheless, the Lebanese army, the state security agency, has never engaged directly with the Israelis, and I'd be surprised if it does so now. The Lebanese have come to rely on the existence of the armed resistance, a coalition led by Hezbollah, to defend that country from the Israeli incursions. And if it were not for Hezbollah, South Lebanon would be North Israel today, basically. So we're looking at something similar with Iran, I believe. even if the US carries out a very large-scale attack, the survival of Iran, the survival with capacity to retaliate, to inflict serious damage on the Israelis and substantial damage on the US military is going to be a sign of an Iranian victory, and that's what we hope for. But I think there's very good reason to believe it. The extent to which we may never know the extent to which the strategic partners in Russia and China will be working during this conflict, but certainly they've been working quite a bit in the lead up to the conflict, and there's no doubt that in terms of intelligence and logistics, the Russians and the Chinese have been doing a great deal. But Iran has become a very strong regional force in itself, and that is the great counterweight to the so-called new Middle East that the US wants to impose on all of the people of this Arab and Muslim part of the world.
Thanks, Tim. Very coherent, very clear. Before we finish up, would love to hear, Barry, your thoughts at this moment in time, and maybe a quick analysis from the Pat O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum.
Well, it seems that there's a lot of prevarication from the Yankee side, which is interesting. Whether that's coming from the more sensible generals within the American forces who realise that maybe this thing's not as simple as I thought it was in the start off. I think that the involvement of Russia and China, we don't know really fully, I suppose, to what extent that is, but even by virtue of the fact that they can offer intelligence assistance and it's some weaponry at least, it seems to have caused some reconsideration of at least how this is done and when it'll be done. It wouldn't surprise me if some sort of compromise is found somewhere or another, because now I know that an non-American attack and an apparent backing away from it would do probably irreparable damage to the American power base. But I just don't know whether it seems to have went on for a long time, and I just don't know whether it's worth the candle really for the Americans at this stage. Somebody might be thinking in the background, is there another way to solve this issue? Maybe we've just took on too much. Now, the thing of it is, there's an awful lot of hardware, but then is that part of the gunboat diplomacy? Is that part of a scare tactic? Do we know? I mean, we don't know exactly what's being said or what's going on. We can only speculate at the best of times. But it certainly seems that Iran, with the assistance of China and Russia in particular, whatever about the other regional forces, is not just going to be a simple pushover. It's not going to be a case of going in and taking out the leadership like they did in Venezuela, for example. And I mean, Russia's shipping oil now to Cuba, and they're basically saying to the Americans, well, stop us. China's assisting in Cuba as well. So there's a lot of things going on there that probably, hasn't been the case in the past, which sensible heads may well have to consider.
Thank you, Barry. Tim, I'm going to give you the final word. So if you'd like to just sum up, Tim, or if there are any other pointers that perhaps we haven't covered that would be worth mentioning. And I just want to remind everyone here that Tim has shared his book, Understanding Yemen. The copies are sold out. Hard copies are sold out, but the PDF has been shared with us. So thank you very much, Tim, for that generous sharing. Thank you.
If you can access the digital copies now. They're on a number of sites. I don't think Amazon's running it at the moment, but most of the other Barnes & Noble and Kobo and all these other ones, there's one link on the chat there. In relation to what Barry is saying, he's right to pick up on these misgivings on the US side, and it's said by a number of the more intelligent US commentators that really the US deep state is not at all enthusiastic about this attack on Iran for the obvious reasons that it could look like, even though they can inflict a lot of damage, no doubt about that, no doubt that they can kill people, it could look like a defeat for the US and be greatly damaging to their prestige and their ability to carry out the so-called gunboat diplomacy and threats in other parts of the world, basically. Of course, yes, Russia Fortunately, Russia is now apparently got at least one ship on the way to Cuba to provide some fuel, because things are very dire in Cuba. It's really another genocide. Basically, they want to starve these people to death, because without fuel, without power, they can't run the pumps for water. They can't transport things. The garbage is piling up in the cities there because they can't clean the cities. You know, that it's a very difficult situation. It's genocidal. They intend to starve the population. We've known from communications from the US side about Cuba in the early 60s, about Chile in the early 70s, about Iran more recently, that the intention is to starve people, to make them desperate, and then even when the government is popular, they will try and do something. They will try and overthrow the government. They don't have any chance of doing this in Iran, really. They don't have any agency to do it. The Mossad and CIA agents on the ground were exposed last month in Tehran in particular. They managed to kill around 3,000 people, hundreds of police and other random civilians, to damage mosques and banks and all sorts of things. But they haven't got the MEK, as was mentioned before, the Mujahideen-e-Khalq. This is a formerly left group which turned into a mercenary cult, basically, which is now based in Albania, was based in France for a while. They certainly have a terrorist capacity. They ported them in from all different parts of the region, perhaps from Azerbaijan, which is also collaborating with the Israelis, through Erdogan's Turkey to supply fuel to the Israelis. So the role of Erdogan is certainly a duplicitous one. He gives lip service to supporting the Palestinians, but he has never stopped supplying fuel to the Israeli military there. Nevertheless, even he is nervous about the war on Iran, because effectively it's a destabilizing force. There's a lot of uncertain outcomes. There's always the uncertainty of escalation. You know, no sane person really wants escalation when they don't know how far it's going to go. You don't know who's going to be drawn in unknown sorts of ways. It could split the Comprador Arab regimes, for example, because they are certainly backpedaling now to try and avoid the wrath of Iran, which is going to target, which has said very clearly many times, it's going to target their US bases there, and virtually all of them have some sort of US bases or infrastructure there. There's a lot of uncertainty here. And from the US side, I think if you look at what Jeffrey Sachs is saying, I think he's right. The only player that really wants this attack on Iran now is the Israelis. And because they have so much purchase on Trump through direct finance and perhaps through some blackmail, maybe they have some videos of him raping children, who knows. This Epstein class has done enormous damage to the US, and the US is still, I mean, when I say the US, I mean the culture, the whole imperial culture, and as well as the deep state is desperately trying to backpedal to distance itself from this sort of damage. But the damage the Epstein class is doing to the US is parallel to the damage that the genocidal operation in Gaza did to the Israeli regime. Most of the world now, not just the global south, most of the Western world hates the Israelis. This is terminal damage for the Israelis, really. And of course, unfortunately, it's totally disconnected to most of the regimes, which are like the one in my country, for example, which are purchased into or through their fear of Washington, which is an important factor to directly supporting the Israelis. Just recently, although there's been huge rallies in my country against the Israelis and demanding sanctions, the Labour government here invited the President of Israel for a tour, and a Labour premier here passed special powers to allow the police to come in and prevent us from doing the marches we were doing for the previous 2 years, weighing into the groups of corralled demonstrators and then bashing them with a special riot squad operation, basically. So all of the previous principal positions you might expected of a Labour Social Democratic regime were thrown out the window because they were desperately trying to please Washington and trying to accommodate the Israeli lobby in this country, which has a great grip still on the minds of the regimes, but the people have broken free from it. The extent of the crimes has been to such a scale that really there's been, in my view, terminal damage to these Western regimes that have supported the Israelis, basically, because what the Israelis have done and what the Western regimes have been exposed at now. And of course, it's not lost on Iran and other countries in the region that we have this pedophilic oligarchy, which has been trading in people's lives and large-scale finance for many, many decades, a type of a hidden secret state, which is still really, in effect, basically. People don't believe what they're being told these days. Nevertheless, they are fooled because you see an effort is being made to try and resurrect these weapons of mass destruction stories, even though they've been used many, many times. Let's remember they were used against Syria too. They are still maintaining that fiction through UN agencies that the Syrian government was using chemical weapons against its own people. Really, so they, in a sense, even though you would think that the credibility of weapons of mass destruction stories fell into a grave in Iraq, they kept being used. They're still being used against Iran. They will use it. These myths that the Iranians are beating to death women that don't wear a proper hijab, even though you have the Iranian leader saying that these are decent religious people and supporting the revolution, and he was jealous of the tears that women in Iran with bad hijabs were crying in these meetings that he participated in. So the reality of Iran is so hidden, so misunderstood from the West so badly that they can get away with these sorts of stories, that police beat women to death if they're not covering their hair properly. What can I say? The propaganda is huge. It's used to, at the least, even if the people who want a color revolution in Iran, the left liberals who I've criticized in articles before, even if they say that they are against the US attacks on Iran, they have had a very damaging effect because they will make people simply not care and not oppose these types of attacks. In other words, people will retreat. They won't use their voices to oppose the attacks. Whether that does any good, because we don't live in democracies really. We have this illusion that we live in democracies. We saw millions of people mobilizing against the invasion of Iraq. It still happened, even though people didn't believe the pretext for it. Something similar is going on today. People will oppose the attacks on Iran, but they will say less because they've been disempowered by all this propaganda, basically. So I think we have some agency. We have voices. We can use these voices, even though we're not soldiers. We don't have weapons. We don't have missiles to add to the attack, but we have voices, and I think that's very important. We use them at this time because a serious aggression is going to take place. It'll be up to the independent peoples of West Asia to resist that. I think they will resist it, but they still need our support. They need our voices to counter this propaganda war, which is part of every hybrid war these days. And this is what the great imperial power relies on these days. Hybrid wars where they rely on the propaganda, the economic warfare, the unilateral coercive measures, the economic pressures, as well as the military pressures. So at least we have voices. At least we have some channels we can use to support independent peoples. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you. You're right. Our weapon is the truth. That's what we have. And we all have a duty after learning so much to go and to translate the truth wherever in our own circles, in our own activist chambers, wherever we are in Ireland, north, south, east, west, Australia, wherever it is. We are obliged to be truth tellers in a world that is saturated with so much propaganda and lies. Tim, it's been an absolute pleasure and honour to have you here again. Thank you for coming on without hesitation so soon after the last time. We really value your analysis, and I know that some of the reading material that you shared with us is already being consumed and shared amongst our comrades, which is a great sign, because education and finding out and discovering what the truth is so necessary. Thank you very much to Barry Murray and to Tommy McKerney of the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum, our panellists who are with us every week. A special thanks to Dr. Saeeb Shaf, son of Gaza, who's based in Belfast. Solidarity with you always, Saeeb, that you again so generously come despite the horror stories that come in every day from Palestine. And to Morgan, based in Cork, as well, for sharing his views and opinions and observations with us. Thank you very much. But I also want to thank everyone for it coming tonight, because the interest and the desire to learn and to understand is very, very important. So everybody, attending, listening and sharing and spreading the information and sharing this video afterwards. You too have a vital role to play in all of this. So I want to formally thank you all before I finish recording. Free Palestine, free Ireland, free Iran from any US Zionist aggression or attack, and long live the resistance.
Thank you, Roisin. Thank you, everyone.